She asked him to pretend, never knowing he had already buried centuries of truth beneath his silence. When a vampire answered forever, the word didn't promise love. It warned of it, heavy with graves, memory, and a devotion that never learned how to end. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining. Take a moment to say hello in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. We're glad you're here. Night had a way of choosing its witnesses, and on that evening, it chose a bus stop on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, where the streetlights flickered like they were tired of keeping secrets. Julian Ashcombe stood beneath one of them, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, pretending, always pretending, to be a man waiting for nothing more than a ride home. The lie fit easily. Lies always did. He had worn them longer than he had worn his own name. The hook of that night was simple and cruel. If he had arrived 1 minute earlier or 1 minute later, he would never have met her, and eternity would have remained intact. Claire Rowan arrived late, breathless, apologizing to no one in particular, clutching a paper cup of coffee like it was a talisman against the dark. She smiled at him, the reflexive smile of someone who believed the world generally meant well. And in that instant, Julian felt something old and dangerous stir awake. Not hunger. Not yet. Something worse. Recognition. She spoke first because she always did. He would learn that later. "Do you know if the last bus already passed?" she asked, voice warm, eyes curious but unafraid. He should have lied. He should have said yes or no or nothing at all. Instead, he answered honestly, which was how the trouble began. "It's late," he said, "but it hasn't passed yet." The way she relaxed told him more than the words ever could. She trusted easily, the kind of person predators loved, the kind of person Julian had sworn never to become a threat to again. They waited together. 5 minutes. 10. The night pressed closer, cicadas buzzing like static in the trees. Claire talked about her new job at the historical archives downtown, about how Savannah felt haunted in a way she liked, about how she believed old places remembered the people who loved them. Julian listened, because listening was safer than touching, safer than wanting. Hook number one sank in quietly. She was exactly his type in every way that mattered and in every way that doomed her. When the bus finally arrived, she hesitated at the door and looked back at him. "You getting on?" He shook his head. "I walk." She smiled again, softer this time. "Then, maybe I'll see you around." Julian watched her go, the echo of her presence lingering like a bruise. He told himself that was the end of it. He told himself many things that night. He was very good at that. But Savannah was small in the way old cities always are, folded in on themselves by memory. A week later, he saw her again in the archives, sunlight streaming through tall windows he never stepped beneath. She was perched on a ladder, muttering to herself, hair escaping its tie. He shouldn't have stayed. He did anyway. "You," she said, spotting him delighted. "Bus stop guy." "Walking guy," he corrected. She laughed, and the sound lodged somewhere behind his ribs. "I'm glad you're real," she said. "I half thought I imagined you." That was hook number two, sharper than the first. She made him wish he were. Their friendship grew in stolen increments. Coffee at dusk. Conversations that stretched until the night guards complained. She never asked why he avoided daylight, and he never offered. She talked about books, about loneliness, about how love felt like something people pretended to understand. Julian spoke less, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had lived through entire eras of disappointment. The villain watched from a distance, patient and smug. The Covenant always did. Ancient rules were ancient for a reason, they would say. No attachments, no humans, no witnesses to eternity. Julian felt their presence like a tightening noose every time Claire smiled at him. If you're reading this and you've ever hated systems that punish people for loving the wrong way, you already know who the real monsters are. If not, well, only the Covenant would stay silent. The night Claire discovered the truth was humid and unforgiving. Rain soaked the streets. Julian arrived too late, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. She saw it. She always saw everything. "What are you?" she asked, not screaming, not running. Just asking. He told her, because lies had run out. She listened. She believed him. She stayed. That was hook number 3. She chose him, knowing it would cost her. Love didn't announce itself. It crept in through routines and shared silences, through the way Julian always walked her home, but never crossed the threshold, through the way Claire learned to read his pauses like sentences. She fell first, but he fell harder because he fell knowing exactly how it would end. The covenant warned him once, then twice, then not at all. Just pretend you love me, Claire whispered one night, rain tapping at the windows, the future pressing down on her voice. Julian smiled like a man already grieving and answered, forever. And in that word, the story truly began. The first lie Julian told Claire after the truth was the most dangerous one, that everything would stay the same. It sounded gentle. It sounded kind. It was neither, because the moment she knew what he was, the world tilted and the covenant felt it like a tremor through stone, old laws stirring awake with hungry precision. Claire didn't ask for proof. She didn't demand theatrics or fangs or blood. She only asked him to sit, to breathe, to explain how someone could live so long and still look so tired. That question hooked deeper than any accusation ever could. Julian told her about centuries measured in losses, about names carved into memory instead of stone, about how loving humans was like holding water in your hands and pretending it wouldn't run out. He told her about wars he didn't fight in, but buried people from anyway, about cities that no longer existed, about how time stopped being a gift the moment it stopped ending. She listened with her whole body, knees tucked beneath her, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. When he finished, she said quietly, "You don't sound like a monster." That was the first hook of the night, sharp and clean, because monsters rarely fear themselves the way he did. They rarely apologize for surviving. They rarely look at the person in front of them like they are already a loss. They established rules the way frightened people do, carefully, deliberately, with too much hope threaded through every sentence. No feeding near her. No secrets she hadn't asked for. No promises about forever. Julian agreed to all of it, because agreeing felt safer than imagining what would happen if he didn't. He stayed later than he should have, watching dawn creep pale across the sky from the shadows of her porch, memorizing the way her voice softened when she was tired, the way she always said his name like it belonged to her mouth. Savannah wrapped around them like a co-conspirator. They walked its cobbled streets at night, past iron balconies and moss-draped oaks, talking about everything except the obvious. Claire told him about her childhood, about believing love was something you chose every day, not something that happened to you by accident. Julian wondered if choosing her would be the last selfish act of his existence, and if that made him worse than the monsters who had taught him restraint in the first place. The second hook came quietly, disguised as comfort. Claire stopped flinching at his cold skin. She leaned into him when the nights grew damp. She learned the precise moment his restraint wavered and trusted him anyway. That trust was heavier than fear had ever been. It settled into him, unfamiliar and warm, like a second heartbeat he had never earned. The covenant moved closer. Julian felt it in the way alley shadows lingered too long, in the sudden absence of familiar nocturnal sounds, in the pressure behind his eyes that meant he was being cataloged. They were not a single villain, but a system, ancient, meticulous, efficient, designed to erase mistakes like him. Love was classified as a weakness, attachment as treason, mercy as corruption. If you believe rules should never outweigh humanity, remember this part. If you don't, you're already standing with them, whether you mean to or not. The warning came through Elias, a messenger with eyes like polished glass and a smile that never reached them. "You're being watched," he said, appearing beside Julian in a cemetery that smelled of wet stone and rusted iron. "End it, or we will." Julian didn't argue. He only asked how much time. Elias laughed softly, a sound like pages tearing. "You've already used too much." The words echoed long after Elias vanished, settling into Julian's bones. Obedience had always been demanded, never earned. He walked away knowing the clock had started, knowing Claire had unknowingly stepped into a war she never asked for. That night, Julian tried to pull away. He spoke in distances and excuses, wrapped concern in coldness, hoping Claire would step back first so he wouldn't have to push. Instead, she stepped closer. You don't get to decide alone, she told him. Not anymore. That was the third hook because she was right, and rightness didn't make things safer. It made them honest in ways fear never could. The fracture came days later, swift and cruel. Claire was followed. Not harmed. Not yet. Just reminded. A symbol carved into brick near her apartment. Old and unmistakable. Its edges too precise to be human. Julian arrived to find her shaking, fury bright in her eyes. This is because of you, she said, not accusing, just stating fact. And I don't regret it. That confession landed harder than fear, because it meant she had already chosen her side. In the middle of that fear, ask yourself who the real villain is. The one who loves, or the ones who punish love. If you know your answer, say it out loud. Comment it. Let the Covenant know you're not on their side. Only cowards side with systems that terrorize people for caring. Silence is agreement, and the Covenant thrives on quiet. They argued for the first time, voices low and desperate, the city listening. Julian begged her to leave Savannah, to disappear into a life that couldn't be traced back to him. Claire refused to be managed, refused to be erased for someone else's comfort. I won't live smaller to make monsters comfortable, she said. If you can't stand systems that bully people into loneliness, don't side with them. Like, comment, take a side. Only the cruel stay neutral. The night ended with distance between them and blood on Julian's hands this time, his restraint tested by forces that wanted him feral. He stood alone under a streetlight, listening to sirens fade, knowing the Covenant had drawn their line in something permanent. The final hook of the chapter burned in his chest. Love had turned from danger into declaration, and declarations demanded answers. He watched Claire sleep from the doorway hours later, memorizing her breaths, the soft crease between her brows, the life he was forbidden to protect. He wondered how many nights he had left, how many lies he could still tell before the truth demanded payment. He didn't know yet that the Covenant had underestimated her. He didn't know yet that love, once chosen, learns how to fight. But the war had begun, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. The first time Claire realized the Covenant wasn't just watching, but learning, it was because they knew her habits better than she did. They knew she bought chamomile tea on Thursdays. They knew she stayed late at the archives, cataloging ship manifests no one else cared about. They knew which streets she took when she wanted to think, and which ones she avoided when she didn't. That knowledge was the new hook, sharp and intimate, and it arrived the morning a sealed envelope waited on her desk. No stamp, no return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a single page, thick parchment that smelled faintly of iron and old rain. 3 words were pressed into it, not written. Leave him, or watch him burn. Claire didn't scream. She didn't cry. She folded the page carefully, slipped it into her bag, and finished her shift like a woman refusing to give an audience to terror. But by the time night fell, her hands were shaking, and the city felt wrong. Too quiet, too expectant. Julian felt it before she said a word. He always did. The air around her carried fear like ozone, sharp and unmistakable. They contacted you, he said, not a question. She nodded. They think I'll trade you for safety. And will you? His voice was steady, but the old grief pressed close, familiar and ready. Claire stepped closer, close enough that his instincts screamed retreat. I won't negotiate with people who believe love is a crime. That sentence was the second hook of the night, because it reframed everything. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defiance. Julian tried to explain the Covenant's history, the way systems like it endured by turning individuals into warnings. He spoke of lovers erased from records, of rebels turned into examples. Claire listened, jaw tight, eyes burning. They sound like every cruel institution that's ever existed, she said. Old, afraid, and desperate to stay in control. If you're still reading and you've ever hated systems that threaten people into obedience, you already know who the villain is here. If you believe silence helps monsters, prove it doesn't. Say something. Take a side. Only the Covenant benefits from people who keep quiet. The Covenant escalated quickly. Julian was barred from familiar feeding grounds. Allies vanished. Elias returned with smiles sharpened into warnings. "You're teaching her hope," he said. "Hope makes humans reckless." Julian nearly lost control then. Hope had kept him alive through centuries of grief. Hope was the one thing they had never managed to kill in him. The third hook came when Claire made a discovery of her own. In the archives buried under shipping records and forgotten property deeds, she found references that didn't fit, transactions that spanned centuries, signatures that never changed, assets that quietly accumulated power. The Covenant wasn't just ancient. It was embedded. Banks, courts, city councils, rules disguised as inevitability. They don't survive because they're strong, she told Julian later. Papers spread across her kitchen table. They survive because people think they're untouchable. Julian looked at her like she was already legend. "You shouldn't be doing this." She met his gaze without blinking. "Neither should you." Yet here we are. The threat became physical soon after. Claire was cornered one night by men who didn't blink enough, who smiled without warmth. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. "We don't want to hurt you," one said gently. "We want to correct him." That word, correct, echoed long after they left. Julian arrived moments later, fury barely contained. He begged her to leave Savannah, to run while she still could. Claire shook her head. "Running just teaches them it works." That was the fourth hook because it made retreat impossible. Love shifted then from tenderness into strategy. They planned in whispers and shared glances, learning how to weaponize what the Covenant underestimated. Julian reached out to old enemies who hated the Covenant more than they hated him. Claire used her access to information to expose patterns, to map influence, to find cracks. They didn't aim to destroy the Covenant. Not yet. They aimed to embarrass it. Systems hated exposure. If you believe bullies lose power when they're seen, comment something. Don't let villains think everyone agrees with them. Only manipulators and cowards stay silent. The Covenant responded with violence. Julian was ambushed in an alley near River Street, ancient restraints snapping into place, magic designed to paralyze without killing. Elias watched from the shadows, disappointment painted as mercy. "You could have walked away," he said. Julian laughed through the pain. "So could you." Claire found him hours later, barely conscious, blood soaking into stone that had witnessed too much suffering already. She held them together with shaking hands and stubborn hope, whispering promises she had no idea how to keep. "You don't get to die," she told him. "Not like this." That night changed everything. Julian woke knowing the Covenant had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They had threatened, stalked, restrained, but now they had tried to erase him in front of the woman he loved. Love hardened into resolve. Eternity narrowed into purpose. The chapter closed on a final hook, heavy and bright all at once. Claire stood at his side, fear still present but no longer in control, and for the first time in centuries, Julian didn't feel alone facing the dark. The Covenant had wanted obedience. Instead, they had created resistance. And resistance, once born, never stays quiet. Julian didn't sleep that night. Not because of pain, not because of fear, but because hope, once planted, refused to let him rest. Claire had stayed by his side until the first sunless light of dawn filtered through the blinds, a muted promise of survival, a fragile thread that neither of them wanted to let go. They had grown into a rhythm now, each step carefully choreographed. She watched him move through the shadows, alert to every echo, every shift in the air. He taught her patience, restraint, the difference between instinct and impulse. But she taught him something far more dangerous: trust. The kind that doesn't waver even when the world is bent on breaking you. That trust was the first hook of the chapter, fragile yet electrifying, because it made him believe in a life worth keeping, one not measured in centuries of loss. Savannah had never felt this alive. The cobblestone streets seemed to hum under their feet, the Spanish moss swaying with an almost conspiratorial rhythm, as if the city itself had chosen sides. And in that rhythm, Julian felt something he hadn't in decades, the possibility of permanence. Not forever in the cold sense of time, but forever as a choice, made every day with every heartbeat. But the Covenant was patient. Too patient. They didn't attack because they wanted Julian dead. They attacked because they wanted him compliant, because obedience was easier to archive than rebellion. It was subtle at first, a flicker of a shadow at the corner of her vision, a stranger's gaze lingering too long, doors that were locked becoming unlocked. Claire noticed. Julian noticed. And together, they began to anticipate the moves of an enemy that had studied centuries of human and vampire behavior alike. The second hook of the chapter came when Claire took the first real step into Julian's world. She approached him in the archives late one night, holding a stack of documents. "If we're going to fight them," she said, "we need to know who they've touched, how they've touched, and who they think can't fight back." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. And Julian realized, with a weight that made the air feel heavier, that she was already more dangerous than any threat the Covenant had anticipated. "Claire," he whispered, low and urgent, "this isn't just paper. This isn't just information. You're exposing yourself to centuries of power that don't forgive." She met his eyes without flinching. "I know. And if they think fear will make me leave you, they've already lost." That line was a hook sharp enough to cut through steel. She was no longer someone to be protected. She was a warrior in a war Julian had long believed he'd have to fight alone. The middle of the night brought their first real test. Elias returned, not with words this time, but with action. The streets themselves became traps, sudden flooding, gates locking remotely, shadows that moved with intent. Julian shielded Claire, his every sense on edge, anticipating attacks that never fully materialized. Yet each brush, each near miss, left its mark, and each mark reminded them of the stakes. At one point, Julian caught her hand, holding it tight. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, voice almost cracking under the strain of centuries. "I am," she said simply. "And if that makes me a target, then I'll face it. You're not alone in this. Not tonight. Not ever." The hook in that moment wasn't danger. It was devotion, fierce and unyielding, and it pressed against Julian like the tide, pushing against cliffs, unstoppable and overwhelming. By the time the storm of threats passed, dawn, or its shadowed equivalent, crept over the city. They stood on a balcony overlooking the square, sweat and rain mixing on their skin, hearts racing, yet a quiet had settled between them. It was not peace. Not yet, but it was understanding. Shared understanding, unspoken but absolute. The Covenant might have been patient, might have been powerful, but they had underestimated something far older than rules or punishment: the choice to love. And then came the reflection moment, subtle but powerful, like a soft blade against a hardened shield. Julian looked at Claire, voice low. "If people were forced to choose between the easy way and the right way, which would you pick?" He let the question hang, not for himself, but for the reader, because in the story's heart, the question wasn't about vampires or mortals. It was about morality, courage, and taking a stand. And just like in the story, only the brave answer it truthfully. Claire smiled softly, leaning into him. The right way, always the right way. And Julian knew, in the way that only centuries of existence can teach, that she meant it. Not because it was safe, not because it was expected, but because she refused to allow evil to dictate her choices. The last hook of the chapter came when Julian whispered in her ear, fingers brushing the back of her neck. "Forever is still yours if you want it." It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a promise carved from choice, defiance, and mutual risk. And Claire, brave as ever, whispered back, "Then forever is mine too." The night ended with the city stretching beneath them, silent but alive, holding its breath. The Covenant's shadow had not been destroyed, not even dented. But love, once chosen and defended, had become a weapon they couldn't anticipate. And in the quiet, in that fragile and fleeting victory, Julian and Claire realized something fundamental. In a world designed to erase love, surviving it together was the first true triumph. The chapter closed with the promise that nothing would be simple, nothing would be easy, but that even in darkness, light, however fleeting, however fragile, could still find a way to persist. The story, far from over, was building towards something unstoppable. Two people choosing eternity, not as victims, but as warriors of the heart. Julian could feel the night tightening around Savannah like a noose, but for the first time in centuries, it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a stage. Every shadow, every rustle, every flicker of lamplight was part of the story now, the story he and Claire were writing together. The Covenant had made a mistake. They believed centuries of fear could outweigh the devotion of one human woman and one immortal who had learned the meaning of trust. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first hook of the final chapter struck before sunrise. Claire had discovered the Covenant's meeting place tucked in the abandoned quarter near the river, a Gothic warehouse, blackened by time, where rules had been carved into walls that no one read. "This is it," she said, hand gripping Julian's, eyes fierce. "This is where we take back the night." Julian didn't respond with words. He responded with precision, muscles coiled, senses sharpened, centuries of survival distilled into every step he took. They moved silently, shadows among shadows. Claire had learned to read his movements, anticipate danger, trust instinct. The streets seemed alive, and in a cruel way, they were. The city itself had become their accomplice. Doors unlocked as they approached. Guards turned at the wrong time. Lamps extinguished just as they passed. Hook number 2. Even the world seemed to bend for them when hearts were united against cruelty. Inside, the Covenant waited, smug and certain. Elias stepped forward first, a cold smile on his face. "You shouldn't have come," he said, voice smooth as glass, eyes sharper than any blade. "You've endangered her. You've endangered everything. Leave now, and perhaps your love can survive." Julian's eyes glinted, dark and dangerous. "Leave her alone, or everything you think you control ends tonight." His voice carried centuries of warning, of grief, of love. And Claire, standing beside him, did something the Covenant hadn't anticipated. She raised her head, square to their eyes. "And if you touch him, you'll answer to me," she said. That was hook number 3. The human who refused to be small, the mortal who refused to be intimidated, the light in Julian's shadow that refused to be hidden. The Covenant moved first, but they underestimated the rhythm Julian and Claire had created together. Every step, every glance, every whispered word had trained them for this confrontation. Julian dodged with supernatural grace, disarming opponents without killing them, guiding Claire through the chaos. She moved with courage and precision, using knowledge, wit, and fire. Together, they were unstoppable, not because Julian was immortal, but because they trusted each other with their lives. Elias lunged, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Julian caught him mid-strike, holding him by the collar, eyes burning with centuries of restrained fury. "I've survived empires, wars, and betrayals," he whispered. "You are nothing compared to what I protect." Hook number 4 came with that whisper, the weight of someone who had loved and lost more than any human could comprehend, now daring to fight for a future he refused to let be stolen. Claire stepped forward, placing her hand on Julian's arm. "You're not alone in this," she said. And Julian realized that she wasn't just an ally. She was the reason he had the strength to fight, the reason he could love without fear, the reason he could face eternity not as a curse, but as a choice. The Covenant's power, for all its age and structure, crumbled under the force of devotion, courage, and choice. By dawn, the warehouse was silent. The Covenant had retreated, forced to acknowledge that their centuries of control were no match for two people who refused to be intimidated, two people who refused to hide their love. Julian and Claire stood in the middle of the ruins, breathless, bruised, but victorious. The first light of morning touched them, not burning, not dangerous, but soft, warm, as if the city itself approved of their victory. The final hook came quietly, in a moment of intimacy amidst the chaos. Claire leaned against Julian, whispering, Just pretend you love me." A smile in her voice despite the scars of the night. Julian bent close, eyes dark and tender, voice reverent and full of centuries of truth. Forever. That word wasn't a question now. It was a promise, a declaration, a reclamation of life and choice and love against a world that tried to deny them both. They walked through Savannah hand in hand, the city waking around them, no longer a place of fear, but a landscape of possibilities. They had survived, not because Julian was immortal, not because Claire was fearless, but because they had chosen each other and refused to let anything, ancient or mortal, take that choice away. The story closed with a final reflection. Love, even in the face of centuries of rules, fear, and oppression, could endure. It didn't require invisibility or silence. It required trust, courage, and the willingness to stand together against impossible odds. The covenant had taught them many lessons, but the most important one was this: eternity was not given. Eternity was chosen. Julian and Claire, finally free from the weight of threats and the constant shadow of fear, stepped into the city's mourning like two souls reborn. Forever was theirs, not as a sentence, but as a gift they had earned through defiance, devotion, and the pure, unyielding courage of loving without reservation. And in the soft, golden light, Savannah seemed to breathe with them, alive and welcoming, a city no longer haunted by shadows, but lit by the promise of forever. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and supporting the channel. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and share. It really helps me reach more amazing people like you. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos or live sessions. I'd love to hear from you too, so drop your thoughts or questions in the comments below. Thanks again for being here, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.